properties of real numbers. Now these first four properties you can see are the first four that we did on the previous page. We had the commutative property of addition, where we said x plus y equaled y plus x, and we switched the order. We had our associative property of addition, where we said x plus y plus z equals x plus y plus z. And on one we had parentheses around the first two, and on the other we had parentheses around the second two. We had our additive identity property, where we added 0 and we said x plus 0 still stayed x. And we had our additive inverse property, where we added opposites and we said x plus a negative x equals 0. So those first four are the same four that we already had. The next one was the distributive property. The distributive property is a combined property. It has both addition and multiplication in it. Because on the distributive property, we were multiplying the number in front to remove the parentheses. Our distributive property says if we have x times y plus z, that we have to distribute that out and take the x times the y plus the x times the z. And then we got rid of the parentheses. So that's the only property you have that has both adding and multiplying. The last properties are your multiplication properties. Some of them are very similar to what we already had. We have the commutative property of multiplication. On our commutative property, we just changed the order. So if I'm multiplying, I'm going to say x times y equals y times x, and I'm just going to flip them around. My associative property is where I move my parentheses. So instead of adding, I'm going to multiply. If I have x times y times z and x times y times z, one might have parentheses around the first two, and the other one might have the parentheses around the other two. Now with the multiplying, sometimes they put the dot in there for multiplying. Sometimes they don't put a dot in there because you don't really need it. Multiplicative identity. You want to think about the identity as what you start with is what you want to end with. When you multiply, if you multiply something times 1, it's not going to change its value. 3 times 1 is still going to give you 3. So my multiplicative identity property is going to say if I take x times 1, I'm still going to end up with an x. So I'm going to look for that multiplying by 1. Multiplicative inverse property. The multiplicative inverse property is the one that's kind of goofy. Now, the inverse of multiplying is dividing. But when we work with fractions and we divide, we end up multiplying by the reciprocal. So what the multiplicative inverse property says is if I take a value times its reciprocal, I'm going to end up with an answer of 1. Their example is going to look something like this. X times 1 over x equals 1. Right? The x's would cancel out and you just get 1. If I have 2/3 times 3 over 2, the 2's would cancel, the 3's would cancel, and I'd end up with an answer of 1. So a value times its reciprocal always equals 1. And the last property is the multiplication property of 0, which is pretty much like it sounds. If I take a value times 0, I'm going to get a 0. Anything times 0 is equal to 0. Now, on my note sheets, the ones on Alex that say Linda's note sheets under the resources, I'm going to have words there that explain those things instead of just the little scribbled examples. So if you're having trouble with this, go on Alex under the resources and print out R30, which is the one of the properties of real numbers, and that'll have all those words beside it that explains those properties. So what I do when I'm looking at the properties is I first decide, is it an addition property, which is the top one? Does it have both adding and multiplying? Then it's probably for sure number 5. Or does it just have multiplying? Then it's going to be 6 through 10. This one here is an adding property, so I know it has to be 1 through 4. 3/5 plus n equals n plus 3/5. All they did was switch the values around. That's my commutative property that we already had before, number 1. The next one, you'll see it just has multiplying in it. So I know it's going to be in 6 through 10. 8 times 4 times 5 fourths, 8 times 4 times 5 fourths. I've just moved my parentheses. That's my associative property, but I have to make sure I do the associative property of multiplication, and so that's number 7. The next one, again, I'm multiplying. I'm taking 2/3 times 0. I end up with 0, and so that's my multiplication property of 0, number 10. And then that last one, that's that weird one. I always think it looks funny. B times 1 over B equals 1. A value times its reciprocal always equals 1. That's that multiplicative inverse property, number 9. So on the next one, again, we're just picking out the properties. 3/5 times, or n times 3/5 equals 3/5 n. Notice they didn't put the dot there, but you could put the dot there because that means times in there. And all they did was switch them around. That's going to be my commutative property of multiplication, number 6. The next one. Notice we have adding and we also have multiplying. That should be a big sign that, of course, it's going to be the distributive property, but just to verify that, they took the a times the c and got ac, and then they'd have to take the a times the 2. That's my distributive property, number 5. I got rid of the parentheses. The next one, 0 plus 2/3 equals 2/3. I know it's one of the first 4. I added 0. It didn't change my value. That's my additive identity, number 3. And there's that one with the reciprocal again. 1/9 times 9 equals 1. That's my multiplicative inverse, number 9. The next one, I have both adding and multiplying again. Hopefully you recognize that's the distributive property. I took the 5 times the 3/2. I also took the 7 times the 3/2, and I got rid of my parentheses. So number 5, my distributive property. The next one, we have a times n times 4/5, and then we have an times 4/5. All I did here was move my parentheses. That's my associative property of multiplication, so number 7. The next one, I'm doing adding and subtracting. I have a negative 5/2 and a positive 5/2, which are opposites. That's going to be my additive inverse property. When I add opposites, I get an answer of 0. So number 4 is additive inverse. And then I have 1 times c equals c. I had c, I multiplied it by 1, which is my multiplicative identity. So multiplicative identity is 8.